in the gym, when we are testing these exercises, what we do is that we really control the technique of the performance, the technical performance. And basically it means that the activity pattern of the hamstrings will be quite similar between individuals because they are doing the same movement. But what we see in running or sprinting is that the individual differences are huge. It was really difficult to see any pattern which was true for everyone. So I cannot say that you activate your biceps femoris more in late swing as compared to like early stance or whatever. So it was really individual. So basically it's really hard to replicate in the gym these activity patterns.
That was András Hegyi, and you're listening to the Just Fly Performance Podcast. I'm your host, Joel Smith. Thanks for being here, and we are on episode 185. So András is a final stage Ph.D. student working at the Neuromuscular Research Center at the University of Jyväskylä in Finland. András's Ph.D. work focuses on regional and intermuscular hamstring EMG activity in different hamstring exercises and in running. So we've done some awesome shows on hamstring injury prevention in the past, such as with Jake Schuster and JB Morin. This is another fantastic addition to this series, as András is a wealth of knowledge in all things gym exercises and their effects on hamstrings in a very specific way, and comparing that to how the hamstrings are operating while sprinting and some of the mechanisms, or looking at some of the mechanisms by which hamstrings get injured. So whether you're looking at it in terms of injury prevention or performance, this is an amazing show that really helps us to fully comprehend or have a very wide sweeping view of all things of what the gym is and might not be doing when it comes to hamstring performance and injury prevention, as well as being able to take some real staples of hamstring training, such as the Nordic hamstring, and really dissect it, do a deep dive into it, and understand how changing some variables in that movement has an impact on the mechanics of the whole thing from a muscle tendon perspective, eccentric loading parameters, and a lot more. So on the show today, we're going to get into András's background as an athlete and researcher, some of the primary mechanisms for a hamstring strain from both a physiological and a biomechanical perspective. We're going to get into dynamics of isometric exercise and muscle tendon activity, the thoughts on the Nordic hamstring, and what's really going on in terms of the muscle contractions and actions throughout the motion, and at what point does it really become an eccentric exercise. We're going to talk about the rotational elements of Nordic hamstring training. We're going to talk about various exercises for hamstring health, such as the diver, the glider. We're going to talk about how doing various modes of Nordic hamstring training have different physiological effects. We're going to chat about the role of sprinting in injury prevention, and we're going to talk about finally, we're going to talk about the adductor magnus and its role in the hamstring injury prevention equation. This was a really fantastic episode and just adds to the field of knowledge in preventing hamstring injuries, something that is always important to talk about. All right, that being said, let's get on to the show, episode 185 with András Hegyi. Yeah, so before we get started with a lot of questions on topics I'm really looking forward to talking about, could you share with us a little bit briefly of your background as an athlete and how you got into research and a little bit of what you're doing right now?
Yeah, sure. Thanks for asking. Well, I was a football player, and that's how I got interested in hamstrings, basically. And, well, I never had a hamstring injury, actually, but that's probably because I finished being a football player when I was around 18 years old, so quite early. And basically I studied kinesiology, and then after finishing my master's in 2013, I started my PhD in 2016 in Finland, in Jyväskylä. And before that, I was studying in Hungary. And now I'm really focusing on the biomechanics, the mechanical function of hamstring muscles.
Yeah, it seems like, I think we were mentioning this a little bit before, but it seems like hamstrings are always, hamstring injury is always one of the top, I feel like it's like the top three topics I'm always reading about in sports science, and probably rightly so. It's it's a really big issue, and it seems like that a lot of really good studies are coming forward with a lot of really good information on it. The first question I'd like to ask you is, what are some, so from the work that you've done, from maybe in this being more from a physiological perspective, or biomechanical, if you want to separate those out into physiological and biomechanical, but what are some of the primary reasons for hamstring strain from that perspective?
Yeah, so the thing is that hamstrings are really complex, and especially studying hamstrings in vivo in human, it's very complicated. So probably it's good to move back to some animal models when we try to understand strain injury mechanism. And for example, we can see from these models that, for example, Richard Lieber has a lot of studies and studying strain injury mechanism. And he reported that the magnitude of the fiber stretch is a good predictor of strain injury. And some other studies also show that the energy absorption of the muscle is really important. For example, when we stretch the muscle to failure, then a highly activated muscle absorbs more energy than less activated or passive muscle. And we know that the hamstrings must absorb a lot of energy in the late swing phase of running. And the same research team of Garrett also found that fatigue has a large component here. So when the force to muscle failure is reduced, then basically there is lower ability to generate force, so less energy is absorbed in the fatigued muscle. So basically the muscle cannot tolerate the same amount of stretch when it's fatigued. But we have much less evidence from hamstring muscles. The only thing we know is that the injuries seem to occur in the late swing phase of the running. And in the running cycle, from a biomechanics point of view, we have a stretch shortening cycle in the hamstrings. And in the stretching phase of this stretch shortening cycle, the muscle must absorb a lot of energy before shortening. And with what we see with increasing running speed is that the peak muscle tendon force increases in the late swing, and the muscle tendon unit is stretched at a higher velocity. So basically the negative work done by the muscle must increase to decelerate the shank in the late swing, whereby the muscles absorb energy, which is returned in the early stance phase. And then additionally, with increasing running speed, then the relative importance of this energy absorption increases. So what I want to get to is that there are basically two ways to acutely increase the energy absorbed in the muscle. First, you stretch the muscle more. However, we know that this may increase the risk for strain injury, which is not really good. But another way is to increase the activation of the muscle so that the muscle gets stiffer. And simulation studies also show that increased hamstrings activity decreases the magnitude and the rate of fiber stretch in the late swing phase. So basically, reducing the amount of fiber or sarcomere stretch seems to be an important factor, as well as the capacity to highly activate the muscle.
So,
and yeah.
Oh yeah, no, I just thought that was interesting that, and I'll let you continue. The only thought I just had quickly was almost like a summarizing thought that it's the hamstrings are a muscle that has a capacity for extreme stretch range under load, and you were saying that the muscle, if we can increase the muscle activation, the hamstrings, it decreases the amount the hamstrings stretch under load when we're sprinting then, just to kind of summarize that.
Yeah, exactly.
Yeah, I mean, that would that change to you guys' knowledge, would that change the biomechanics at all? Like in the sense of how that shin snaps out as the athlete is moving forward? Or is it really just a physiological occurrence in the way the muscles and tendons interact, kind of independent of biomechanics? Or is that something that you guys have not? You said it's a complicated area, and so I know there's going to be a lot of complicated topics here. Do you know if there's a difference, or if that may impact the biomechanics?
Well, it's really hard to say because with fatigue what we can see typically is that we have an anterior pelvic tilt, which basically stretches the muscle more. That's something we typically see with fatigue. About knee range of motion, I can't recall any studies on that, but it's I would assume that activation affects muscle mechanics, and yeah.
Sure thing. And I hope I didn't break your train of thought there with where you're going as well. And I think it's interesting you brought up the fatigue and the pelvic tilt. That's one of the things that I'm thinking of in working with multiple athletes, not even in running, but also even swimming, to see how fatigue, as soon as the basic trunk and pelvic positions start to change because of fatigue and the way the breathing operates and fatigues, how everything from that outward, the pelvis and the breathing cavity outward, starts to change. And so I think that I'm glad you mentioned that, because I think it would be very easy to isolate things specifically to the hamstring and not the rest of the body with how other levers are changing. And so I think that's interesting. I hope I didn't I hope I didn't break your train of thought with what you were going for there when I kind of interrupted you.
No, it's fine. You didn't really interrupt. But I wanted to. The point is, as you mentioned, that like there are several muscles acting here, and which affect the kinematics and the stretch of the muscle, the stretch of the fascicles. And of course, it would be the best to see how the muscles actually work during the sprinting. And there is a debate whether the fascicles are rather isometric or eccentric. And actually, this is how my PhD started, because like the laboratory where I work now in Jyväskylä, it's one of the oldest laboratories in ultrasound imaging. We have like 4 or 5 ultrasound machines and a lot of experience with imaging of different muscles. And there was this PhD project where the aim was, under the supervision of Neil Cronin and Taija Finni, where the aim was to examine fascicle behavior of the biceps femoris in different movements, basically, and in different fatigue situations. But the thing is that the muscle is so complex and the fascicles are so long, and basically when you are running, then the muscle works really in a 3-dimensional manner that it's really difficult to capture with a 2-dimensional method what's happening there. But it's probably quite difficult at this point to see what happens at the fascicle level, and we kind of try to measure some other things which can potentially affect this fascicle behavior. For example, the activation of the muscle or inter-muscular coordination.
With I like that you mentioned that it's hard to. I like you mentioned like the 3D or the 3 dimensions of the muscle motion versus, because I think that is a generality with a lot of people. It's easier to put the body into a 2-dimensional model or just sagittal plane only, and then and as well as the assumption that when you're doing, and I'd like to get into this too, when you're doing a Nordic hamstring, that, well, the body is moving in a, I guess you could say, eccentric manner because you're doing negative work, but what's going on with the muscle tendon complex at that point, in terms of, is the muscle, how much is the muscle lengthening, or is the muscle pulling, and is the tendon stretching? And so I think that was a question that we were going to get into today as well. And I'd love to get into the rotational elements of the muscle work, as you were saying too. But first, I would like to get to that is, when we're doing a movement like a Nordic hamstring, what do we think is going on there from a muscle perspective? Is it actually an eccentric exercise? Is there more isometric contractions in the muscle, even though there is negative work being done? And how is there some specificity loss potentially between there and what's going on in sprinting?
Yeah, this is a really fascinating and excellent question. So, as I mentioned, it's really hard to say what happens at the level of fascicles. And we know that the behavior of the fascicle is not always the same as the behavior of the muscle tendon unit. And it seems eccentric, but at the level of fascicles or muscle fibers, maybe it's not so eccentric. And actually, there is data on this, because Brent Reiteri and his group, they used a really long ultrasound probe. It was like 10 centimeters to capture fascicle behavior of biceps femoris in Nordic hamstring exercise. And of course, they couldn't get the image, very, very good image from all participants, but from many participants, what they could see is that there is actually a shortening behavior of the fascicles first, and then it's kind of isometric, and the eccentric comes only around the peak knee flexion torque. So there is a lot of component which is not really eccentric at the fascicle level based on their data, which was presented a few years ago, and I hope that they get to publish this very soon.
So it's only really eccentric. Okay, so just to summarize, and just so I'm kind of aware of what's going on in a better way. So when you start the Nordic hamstring, the muscles obviously have to shorten right off the bat initially, right when you start to drop. But as soon as that happens, then it becomes more of an isometric for the duration until you reach the peak torque, or that point that is basically as far as you can go down before you probably start to fall. Then it maybe gets eccentric a little bit again. Yeah,
exactly.
Okay. Right on. Yeah, that makes sense to me. And it seems like, so you were saying before that in the biceps femoris hamstring, which is the most commonly injured hamstring muscle, it may not be as linear as we think in actual sprinting as well. Like it may be, you said there were some rotational factors. It's hard to study exactly what goes on in that muscle and actually sprinting. Could you expand on that, and specifically some of the rotational elements of how the hamstring works?
Yeah, so if we think about rotation, then basically the lateral hamstrings, the biceps femoris, is an external rotator, and the medial hamstrings, mainly the semitendinosus, is rather an internal rotator. So basically the running technique, the rotational movements in sprinting will also affect, most likely, how these muscles contribute to sprinting. Yeah. So is there anything about rotation? This is what came into my mind just now.
You're listening to the Just Fly Performance Podcast, brought to you by Simply Faster. Sure. Yeah, I think that's good with that one. I did want to, in terms of applying it all too, and like the gap between what we see in the lab and then what we're doing in the gym. How critical is it to perform, based on what you said on the Nordic hamstring exercise? And I think, from my understanding, the metadata and the research is that Nordic hamstrings are effective. But what's your take on performing eccentric exercises in the gym? How critical is it to be doing eccentric work versus perhaps isometric work? And I don't want to make this too many. I have a habit of making things too many questions in one, but I also want to ask about the idea of simply doing high speed sprinting and then regular traditional gym work. So maybe let's start with just how critical is it to perform eccentric exercises in the gym versus perhaps other things in a program?
Yeah, definitely. This is a huge area. Because it really depends on what is the aim of the training, what you want to achieve. And from many point of view, eccentrics may be beneficial. Like usually what we want to see is some neural adaptations, like decreasing inhibition with some eccentric training, or from mechanical or muscle morphological perspective, we may want to, for example, increase fascicle length. But for example, if I want to go into the motor control part first, we know that we can reach higher force in eccentrics than in concentrics, and the difference compared to isometric is like 1.2 to 1. Like in vivo, it's about 20% higher the force in eccentrics than in isometric. And interestingly, in vitro, we can reach like 80% higher force, and that's most likely because of the inhibition. And there are studies showing that with eccentric training, you can decrease this inhibition. So it means that the potential to produce force increases, which probably means that in sprinting, the muscle can be activated more and you can absorb more energy in the late swing phase of running. So from this perspective, I think that eccentrics can help. And also like fiber 2 type 2 fibers seem to undergo more hypertrophy after eccentric only as compared to concentric only exercises. So it may be that the fast muscle fibers are recruited more in eccentrics than in concentrics. And we also know that the stretch shortening cycle is really fast in sprinting, and the muscle has to switch on and off really fast. And we know from some studies that the area of the type 2 fibers is related to early rate of force development. So this may be advantageous too, probably.
Sure. It makes me think some of the talk on the different mechanisms, or even looking at something like a Nordic hamstring, and it's like, okay, there's an eccentric component to this, but there's also a really big isometric component to this. It makes me think that there's probably a very good potential for a quote unquote isometric exercises in the weight room of the same type for hamstrings. Let's just say for hamstrings, just because there's always going to be that shortening phase while the muscle pulls against the tendon, even if it's isometric, perhaps. I would imagine that there could be, with that in mind, there could be a lot of advantages for some isometric work as well in the gym, just because like you said, is an eccentric really an eccentric, and is an isometric really an isometric? I would think that there's probably a benefit with multiple phases or positions or phases of muscle contraction when we're in the gym.
Yeah, exactly. But most of the research is on eccentrics and hamstrings, and especially in Nordic hamstring exercise, even though it's not entirely eccentric. And the mechanisms behind is not really clear. We can see that the number of injuries decreased, but why it decreased, it's not super clear. For example, we can also see from earlier study of Carl Askling applying some exercises at long muscle length, like the diver and glider exercises, where the activation of the muscle is very low, but you are just working the muscle at the long muscle length. And then it was also really effective to reduce the number of injuries, although it's a very different movement compared to the Nordic hamstring exercise. So it's also possible that they they attack the problem from different sides.
Yeah, you have to tell me more about that. So it was Askling, the diver, and the glider, because what you were mentioning there reminded me a little bit about some of the movements that I tend to use a lot called extreme isometrics, where it's just it's basically an isometric held at an extreme joint angle where the muscle is lengthened, and it's not necessarily a high intensity muscle contraction. So, for example, a lunge where you're in the fully stretched position at the bottom, but it's not necessarily high intensity. Or you could do a similar thing with a hamstring, with just a gentle loaded hamstring stretch over a long period of time. And I've found those to be really helpful in preventing injuries. So is that kind of like the diver and the glider? Like you're just in a long, it's like gentle weighted stretching of sorts, or how could you explain those a little bit better?
Yeah, sure. So the diver is very similar to a one-leg Romanian deadlift, basically, but you are doing this only with your body weight. So it's really low load, but the knees are quite extended, and basically you are stretching the hamstrings with a hip flexion. And the glider is also very similar when basically it's a bit more difficult to explain.
That's okay. We'll try to figure it out.
Basically, you are just doing, you are just sliding with one leg, with flexing the hip. You are sliding backward, or flexing one hip and extending the other. You are kind of sliding forward and backward at the same time with your legs, and then you're coming back. So those are the main exercises applied in this long length exercise protocol of Askling.
Sure. Do you know how long those exercises are done for, like 1 or 2 minutes at a time, or how long do they perform those for?
Well, if I'm correct, it's rather short. So it's like 2, 3, 4 seconds.
Oh, so, okay.
One way and back another way. So it's quite short.
Okay, interesting. So that's a little bit of a contrast to the isometrics that I use, but kind of the similar principle.
It feels like anything can work.
Yeah. I mean, it's as complex as the hamstrings are in action. It almost seems like there's a lot of. It's almost as if all these exercises are improving a different component of the whole equation, or something like that. I was even thinking with the Nordic hamstring itself, if the max eccentric lengthening is at that peak torque, if you could somehow prolong the peak torque portion of that, when like that point right before you break, if you could almost offer support right there to the athlete or something like that for a few seconds, you could hold them up a little bit for like 2-3 seconds. I wonder if you get more out of it, or it's interesting. One of the questions I know we were going to talk about, and I think this is interesting because the first time I heard of this modification for the Nordic hamstring, it was Brett Contreras talking about doing a Nordic hamstring with flexed hips versus extended hips, and that changing a few dynamics of the exercise itself. So could you share with us a little bit about how does doing a Nordic hamstring with flexed versus extended hips affect the training effect of the movement?
Sure. Well, in terms of training effect, it's quite difficult to say because we don't have too much evidence, no research on that. But at least we have some biomechanical evidence what happens with with the activation of the muscle, what happens with knee flexion torque when you are performing these exercises. And I was really lucky to get involved in this study with JB Morin and the inventor of the it's a Nordic hamstring device.
The Nordboard?
No, not the Nordboard, but it's called Hamtech.
Okay.
The inventor of the guy is JP Giacomo from France, and basically we use this new machine to set the hip angle in either extended position or 90 degrees flexed position. And we compared, basically we matched the load between the exercises. So the highest load, it was eccentric 1 repetition maximum in a range of motion from 90 to 15 degrees. So the advantage of the exercise, the machine, is that you can either decrease or increase the load quite easily to match the range of motion between exercises and also between individuals. So that's what we talked about. Maybe it's not only about eccentrics, and many studies show that working the muscle at a longer length, either isometrically, concentrically, it can help you to prevent injuries, to increase fascicle length. So what we found in this study was that when the hips were flexed to 90 degrees, then we reached a much higher knee flexion torque. And again, the relative loads were matched between the exercises. But interestingly, the hamstrings activation was much lower. So this actually means that, of course, it's possible that other muscles contributed to the movement more, but the difference was huge, which practically means that we have first of all, more inhibition in the hamstrings, because we couldn't activate that much when the hips were flexed. And also, the passive force was higher. So it means that probably, as compared to performing with the extended hips, with flexed hips, you have a more eccentric component. You are stretching the elastic elements more. So that's probably why we have a much higher knee flexion torque there. So basically, what I can say now is, if you want to target your hamstrings at a longer muscle length, and if you want to emphasize the eccentric part, then probably it's good to do it with a flex hip as compared to extended hip.
I wanted to take a quick break from the show to share with you a little bit about what our sponsor, simplyfaster.com, now has available in their store. You hear me mention in the outro of the show all the time about the Freelap timing system in the K-Box, which I have and use regularly. But today I wanted to share a little bit more about the bar speed monitoring units that Simply Faster has, which is the GymAware and the new portable Flex unit. So let me start with the GymAware. I mention it regularly on the show. It's been referred to as the Cadillac of bar speed monitors. Carl Valley calls it a lab inside a lunchbox, as the readings you get out of the GymAware go well beyond typical concentric or just the up phase of the lift velocities. Rather, you can measure the entire shape of the barbell lift in terms of eccentric velocity, range of motion, and total work done. Total work being awesome, by the way, especially like comparing a long-armed bench presser or a 6'10 squatter versus a 5'11 point guard. So you're getting all these extra metrics that you're not getting on other units. It's perfect for teams wanting to manage the weight room, and the data synchronizes to software platforms such as CoachMe Plus, Team Builder, and Athlete Monitoring. So new to the store is the Flex, which is the ultra-portable and lower-price travel version of the coach's favorite GymAware. So just like the GymAware, the Flex measures the shape of each rep, range of motion, total work done, eccentric dynamics. So for this and the GymAware, this is the advantage that a force plate would have over just knowing how high you jumped. You're getting many other metrics and information that go into this unit of work. Compared to similar portable bar speed monitors, this unit gets the entire rep rather than a fraction. So you have here two awesome tools. And if you're interested in upping your game in the velocity-based training and bar speed world, I would definitely recommend heading to the store at simplyfaster.com and checking into these two units. All right, let's get back to the show. Yeah, that makes a lot of sense.
Yeah.
Yes, sorry, I could have jumped in there. I was going to say, as I was trying to put it together in my head, you were saying it was more knee torque at the knee, but then less hamstring. I was thinking, well, it must be because it's more on the tendon complex, like the lengthened tendon complex and the forward lean. I feel like you could probably go down further, quite a bit further in that situation before you reach the breaking point with the flex torso, and then but because it was almost more of a mechanical thing. It's almost like you're winding, like you're winding up like the windlass mechanism in the foot. Like you're winding up the tendons by leaning forward, stretching the hamstring tendons, and that's what creates the little bit more the knee torque. But to me, I'm like, well, wouldn't that be more similar to running potentially? Because it is more specific to that. If you took a picture of the bottom of that movement, it's more like swing phase a little bit, because the torso relative to the hip is a more similar position to someone actually running than if you're completely extended.
Yeah, exactly. It's more similar to running, and probably the adaptations are more favorable, but it's really hard to say at this point.
Yeah, exactly what's going on in there. I could definitely see that. It seems that a spectrum of hip flexion angles could even be good. I have this like picture in my head of a set. One of the things I'm getting into these days is variability within a single training set. So maybe even doing like one rep where you're totally straight, another rep where you're a little more bent forward, another rep a little more bent forward. So maybe we don't know what's going on entirely, but at least you get the full spectrum of hip flexion and active and passive forces. And plus the muscles will probably fatigue. So by the time you're to the fully forward lean, you got a lot of passive force going on, but at least there's probably some specificity. And it makes me think a little bit too. Do you guys do anything with, like somebody who does the Nordic hamstring and has a lot of anterior pelvic tilt while doing the Nordic hamstring? Because athletes who are weak in their hamstrings, I know, tend to do that a lot. That would probably give you a similar effect to what you were talking about it's more passive force. The muscle isn't activating. It's probably more of the hamstring pull on the knee when you're really anteriorly tilted versus if you're, at least when you're trying to do it with the body straight and extended, but then the athlete's tilting. And I would imagine in those cases, well, you should just tell them to lean forward then, so they stop tilting the pelvis or extending the spine. I hope I'm not overcomplicating it, but does anterior pelvic tilt in the exercise? Do you guys look at that at all?
Well, it's related to hip flexion basically. But as you mentioned, it's very typical that people who are, especially those who are not that strong, they actually do this anterior pelvic tilt. And with this, they can stretch the muscle more, so they can use their elastic components more. They don't need to activate the hamstrings that much. It's very typical, but it also happens in running. So when you are getting fatigued, then this anterior pelvic tilt comes because you cannot activate the muscle so much anymore, so you cannot absorb that much energy. And the problem is, if you want to sprint fast, then it's the acceleration is coming from the early stance phase of running. But if you can absorb more energy in the late swing, then of course it's you can reach higher acceleration in the early swing. So it's very to reach high performance. It's kind of reasonable to do this anterior pelvic tilt, even though it's from an injury perspective, it's not really good.
Yeah. To me, the ability of the pelvis to or the idea that when we sprint, it should be with an entirely neutral pelvis and the hips don't move at all. Like it doesn't work. Like there's different torques created from different pelvic positions. And I think it's an important component of looking at the entire equation, as well as so what we do in the gym and then the track or the training pitch and all that stuff.
Yeah, exactly. I totally agree with this.
András, one thing I was really looking forward to, well, as well as everything else, but one thing particularly that I saw that you've been doing that really intrigued me was studying basically every hamstring exercise, not every single hamstring exercise you could possibly do in the gym, but I know you did work looking at a lot of common hamstring training exercises in the gym. And outside of the Nordic hamstring, what else in the gym have you found that comes near or may replicate some of the forces seen in sprinting on the hamstring?
Yeah. Well, it's in terms of forces, it's really difficult to say, because in other exercises we didn't really measure the actual forces, and those were measured mainly at a lower load as compared to the Nordic hamstring exercise. The Nordic hamstring exercise is kind of a supramaximal load for most individuals when they are performing with body weight only. But in the other exercises, these were performed at submaximal load. But what we did is we measured the activation of the hamstrings, how those exercises activate hamstrings at a 12 repetition maximum load. So kind of they are comparable, how they activate the hamstrings, which exercise activates hamstrings more or less. Is it possible to activate biceps femoris more than semitendinosus and vice versa? And yeah, there were some exercises like slide leg curl exercise and like upright hip extension conic pulley exercise. Those, for example, activated hamstrings quite a lot. But what was really difficult is to activate one of the hamstrings but not the other. Like it seems like it's quite challenging to do that. And well, similar to previous studies, we could see that hip extension performed on a Roman chair activates biceps femoris slightly more than semitendinosus. And prone leg curl exercise and Nordic hamstring exercise, they tend to activate semitendinosus more than biceps femoris. But in most of these, we actually just averaged the whole range of motion in either the eccentric or the concentric part. And let's kind of figured out later, after we published this paper with a lot of exercises, that it's probably not the best way. And because what we could see in the Nordic hamstring exercise, when it was performed with extended hips, then basically throughout the range of motion, the which muscle was activated, it changed. Basically, at the beginning, we had higher activity in the semitendinosus than in the biceps femoris. But at the end of the range of motion, close to knee extension, we had higher activity in the biceps femoris than in the semitendinosus. So basically, the ratio between the two muscles changes, which kind of makes sense because at more extended knee position, the moment arm of the biceps femoris is also larger than that of the semitendinosus. So basically, there is a mechanical advantage of that muscle. So it's kind of natural that you will activate more that muscle close to knee extension. But and it's really difficult to say how these like activation strategies translate into adaptations.
Yeah, that's exactly what I was gonna say and ask you, is how you said that at the early range of motion it's semitendinosus or the medial hamstring. On the end of the range of motion it's biceps femoris or lateral hamstring. So how does that compare to a sprint cycle gait? Because I'm thinking about the leg coming through in sprinting, and there's going to be that twisting of the tibia a little bit, or the leg, as you're getting into that supination to step. So how does do you guys know how that changes at all in actual sprinting? Like, is it similar to what happens as the leg unfolds in sprinting, or is that a little bit different animal, or is it just too complex for us to completely have a handle on at this point?
Yeah, well, it's a really important point, because in the gym, when we are testing these exercises, what we do is that we really control the technique of the performance, the technical performance, and basically it means that the activity pattern of the hamstrings will be quite similar between individuals, because they are doing the same movement. But what we see in running or sprinting is that the individual differences are huge. So we used high-density EMG over the hamstring muscles, which means that we measured from different muscle regions, proximal, middle, distal region of the biceps femoris and semitendinosus, and see which muscle or which region you activate in different phases of the running stride cycle. But what we could see is that basically the individual differences were huge, and it was really difficult to see any pattern which was true for everyone. So I cannot say that you activate your biceps femoris more in late swing as compared to like early stance or whatever. So it was really individual. So basically it's really hard to replicate in the gym these activity patterns. Yeah, so hard to say anything about running. The only thing I can say is we tested different running speeds, and these very unique activity patterns were maintained across running speeds. So, of course, the activity increased in the hamstrings with increasing running speed, but the relative activity of the muscles or muscle regions remained the same within individuals.
I see. When with those exercises in the gym, and thanks for listing some of those. I was kind of trying to mentally think. Well, you said the back extension on the Roman chair is more biceps femoris, and then the cone, like the versa-pulley or cone pulley hip extension, and the slide board hamstring curl. Those are really good, but those are more medial hamstring exercises.
It was quite similar activity between the two muscle in those. But we can also see actually, because I forgot to mention the proximal distal distribution of the EMG activity, because we can see there are huge differences in how you activate different regions of the muscle. And what we can see in most exercises is that the activity is the lowest in the proximal region of the biceps femoris. And basically that's where most of the hamstring injuries occur. So it seems quite challenging to activate that region.
I see.
I don't know if it's good or not, but that's the case.
That's the biggest discrepancy of the gym, is that most of the gym exercises, and I would assume Nordics are included in that, it's more the distal, the outside aspect, or the part closer to the toes than the sprinting. It's the near that, and interesting. So I was going to ask a question about turning your toes in or out in the gym, but it seems like that's not. It's probably not as important as getting the proximal or distal attachments, really, because it seems like you could make anything in the gym based off what you're saying. We can get the lateral hamstrings, we can get biceps femoris. It's hard to get the right part of it. Do you think, like, would the velocity play a role? Like has there been studies on doing, say, a back extension? I know there's like reactive back extensions people will do where they go really, like on the Roman chair, where they go really fast versus a slower. Did you guys account velocity into anything like that, and how it might have changed the activation?
Yeah, it's possible that the velocity has some effect, but it's I mean, it's really hard to say. We didn't examine this at this point, but it's something to really look into. It might be quite important to see.
Yeah, I'm just curious. I think about where it almost like slow versus fast and how things change. Since sprinting is the king of specific activation, I'd like to get, before our time's up, on the role of sprinting itself on injury prevention. One of the things that JB Morin mentioned to me on our last podcast, and I think it was actually right at the end, and I think it was actually after we stopped recording, which it's always said in podcasting, a lot of the best stuff is after you stop recording. And I meant to say this in the show notes, but he had said something about how it was something like Nordic hamstrings and sprinting both had a positive impact on improving fascicle length. So there's like these similarities, but then sprinting itself is it's the most specific thing you can do. So can you tell me a little bit about the role of sprinting in injury prevention and how we should look to utilize that?
Yeah, exactly. So, well, the thing is that when we are doing the exercising in the gym, then it's easy to increase the load on the muscle, but really doing high velocity movements, it's like challenging sometimes in those specific positions. And like, as I mentioned, in the gym, we like to control things more. And like, even if I like try to replicate the like the propulsion phase of sprinting with some exercises, the movement is somehow controlled, and you lose this individual like movement pattern. Mm-hmm. So it's quite difficult, that part. And it's as I mentioned, it's like you are training a different point at the force velocity curve, basically. So it's a very different stimulus for the muscle than those slow exercises in the gym. So what I like as a field method is resisted sprints, where you kind of learn how to orient the force in the right direction to accelerate. Because I believe that if you can better apply the force on the ground actively, then you need kind of have to rely less on the stretching of the muscle in the late swing. And I really liked the recent study of Johan Lahti, who showed that basically with this applying this resisted sprint, it doesn't really change the kinematics of the running. So it could be quite good for training hamstrings.
With the resisted,
more sprint specific training. Yeah.
With the resisted sprint, are we talking resisted like heavy sled acceleration, or is this because I know most of the strains happen in more upright running. Is there an element of that would apply for upright, or is it? I know there's probably late acceleration phase, or even an acceleration could certainly happen as well. But is there anything that related to upright running with that?
Well, what I was thinking about is that I was talking about the acceleration part, even though the hamstrings are rather get injured at high speed. But if you kind of learn how to orient the force more, then so you know how to push yourself forward, then kind of you lose less energy, you fatigue later, which can help when you are getting there to the high speed, if it's clear.
Yeah, I do know acceleration mechanics, they'll start to manifest themselves as athletes do move into upright running, or the more efficient and effective the acceleration, the better the top end speed can be as a result. So I know they are linked together. I definitely can see that. Yeah,
I agree.
I know something that Jake Schuster had said on this podcast before was he had said that the teams that he has seen in all his travels and his experience in sports science and sports performance training is the teams that seem to be hurt the least or have the least hamstring injuries were the ones who incorporated some form of high speed running in their training, like team sports like soccer, football, whatever. They did maximal velocity sprinting at least once a week, and that seemed to be a really, really big preventer in hamstring pulls. And based off everything you're saying, that it's the most specific thing you can possibly do.
Yeah, exactly.
So it definitely makes a lot of sense to me.
Yeah, exactly. It's I think in terms of sprinting, it's all about how you gradually increase this maximum velocity exposure to minimize the injury risk. So it's probably all about progressive loading there, and also running technique, of course. So it's I think Jordan Mendigucci will come up with some data on this quite soon, hopefully. Mm-hmm. I don't really know his results, but at least I think that he has some results showing that you can actually change running technique in terms of, for example, pelvic tilt, mm-hmm. To reduce hamstring injuries. Well, I'm looking forward to this data. My main question is whether this affects the performance of the sprint, or is it somehow compensated?
Yeah, I think it would be very interesting to see like the data with if it was somehow possible to see some data points with when people get hurt in sport, like how their posture. I don't know how you get this. It had to be really fine tuned, but if their posture had gotten worse over the course of playing or something like that, to the point where they weren't as reciprocal out of their anterior pelvic tilt into posterior and back and forth or something like that. I'd be interested to see those types of things. I think there's a lot of
yeah, exactly. I think we need a lot of technical improvement on that side.
Yeah.
Because we are doing the measurement in the lab mostly. We are putting a lot of markers on the body, and mostly the players are running on a treadmill or mm-hmm. maybe overground. But what really happens in the game, that's another question. And we have very little data on that. So I hope that some deep learning approach will get there, like when you can kind of track the movement of all players and see how the kinematics change in those sprints. I would be really interested to see that, and I think we are getting there.
Yeah, it'll be interesting when that comes out for sure. András, last question I have for you. And you had written about this a little bit in the article recently, the interview on Simply Faster, but the adductor magnus. And so people have called it the fourth hamstring for talking hamstrings. It has a lot of shared actions. What do we need to know anything about this muscle, or is there anything that's worth mentioning in terms of preventing a hamstring, its neighbor, the hamstring, from pulling, or anything in training?
Yeah. I really like that muscle because we don't know too much about this muscle. It's also really complex, but it's really difficult to examine because it's a deep muscle. So, for example, I cannot put electrodes over it. Mostly with the EMG, we are measuring from the surface of the skin. It's not possible for adductor magnus because it's deeper. So. But we can also see it has a very complex architecture, and it's a huge muscle. It's actually the second biggest muscle of the leg, and it has a large physiological cross-sectional area, which actually just shows the force production capacity of the muscle. And, for example, it's larger than that of the semimembranosus, which is basically the strongest of the hamstring muscles. And it has a lot of functions. Like there is a recent study showing these guys put intramuscular EMG electrodes in different portions of the muscle, in proximal distal portions, and what they saw is that the the activation was the highest in the adductor magnus and hip extension movement, even higher than in hip abduction movement. So it's a very strong hip extensor. So it basically shares this common function with the hamstrings. So it definitely affects the function of the hamstrings. And also it contributes to the rotational movements, like the proximal region rotated externally and the distal region of the muscle rotated internally. So external rotation is similar to biceps moris and internal rotation is similar to semitendinosus or semimembranosus. So basically there are a lot of common functions. So probably this is why we mentioned this muscle as the fourth hamstring. And as I mentioned, it's a huge muscle, so it definitely has a lot to do with hamstring muscle function. But just some of these muscles are really difficult to examine. So I think we need to some technical improvements to really examine all the muscles contributing to hamstrings function.
Yeah, it's amazing to me just how complex the body is with all these different. In this position, it does this. In this position, it helps here more. It's so complex. But András, I think that's all the time I have for the show today. I can't thank you enough for being my guest for this show. I really appreciate it. So thanks again for your time. Appreciate having you on.
Thank you very much.
All right, that does it for another show. Thanks for tuning in today. We really appreciate it. And that was just a fantastically informative episode on all things hamstring. And I know my knowledge level has definitely leveled up as a result. If you enjoy what we're doing, don't hesitate to leave us a rating or review on iTunes, Stitcher, whatever you're listening to. It would definitely help us out and we would really appreciate it. Also, don't forget to visit our sponsor, simplyfaster.com. They have a fantastic blog on all things sports performance and have the best of in each category of sport tech in their online store. From free lap timing system to gym wear, force plates to contact grids, they really have it all, and I would highly recommend checking them out for your sports performance and tech needs. All right, well, that does it for this week. We'll see you guys next week with another great guest. Have a good one.